Good evening, everybody. My name is Aaron. Welcome back to Molly's Kitchen. Today we're going to go over a really quick, simple, easy recipe for butternut squash soup. My wife made me a believer of it, and ever since I had hers, I love it. So I'm duplicating that recipe today just for you guys. We're going to start off, like normal, with our regular onion. The trick to making the onion is by cutting it 1/4-inch strips vertically. Once you got your vertical cuts made, you can always make your horizontal cuts. We're going to go 1, 2, 3. Now you can use a regular plain white or a sweet onion for this recipe. This just happens to be what we have in our house, so that's what we're using right now. It can be any kind of an onion though. It doesn't have to specifically be a red onion. So now that I got my onion perfectly diced, I'm going to go ahead and pile it all together, and we're going to set it off to the side. The next thing that we're going to talk about is the Granny Smith apple I have right here on the cutting board. We use Granny Smith because they're a little bit on the sour side, and they tend to be really good. The tart plays really well with the butternut squash. My mom got me this tool right here. You can usually find them at like a Bed Bath & Beyond or a Williams-Sonoma store. They're pretty cheap and very easy and quick to use. You just turn the crank and it automatically starts peeling, coring, and slicing your apple all at one time. Just like that. Pull that out. Set the cork to the side. Now we can get this out of here. From here, all we got to do is take the rest of the peel off and slice it in half. Remember that with this soup, we're going to end up pureeing it in a blender, so it's going to be super velvety smooth. Like I said, this is butternut squash soup. I've taken the liberty of already coring these. I'm going to show you in just a second how to core these the easy way. All it requires is a regular tablespoon. But first, I forgot, we have to take care of the ginger. Ginger, much like the apples, really sets this soup aside from all the rest. Ginger, when it's fresh, packs a lot of power, so when you use it lightly. You don't want too much, because too much ginger, it's going to be really nasty. So we're just going to cut this rough chop, no specific size or anything. It doesn't need to be minced, but you need to cut it up pretty good. And like I said, everything is going in a blender anyway, so it doesn't have to be perfect. Nothing fancy. Just chop it up. And we're going to use that when we boil this. Well, we're not boiling it, but when we cook this soup, we're going to use that ginger in the cooking process. Next thing we're going to work on is the garlic. For this recipe, I usually like to use 2 regular sized garlic cloves. Remember guys, I've gone over it before, and I'm sure I'll go over it again, but the easy way to handle garlic is to just take the clove with the wrapper on it, set it on your cutting board, place your hand on the butt of the knife, and give it a good smack. You don't have to hit it hard, but hit it hard enough so it cracks the peel on it. And make sure that you cut the little end off the end piece, because that's an unedible part of the garlic. Now that I have the skins off, I'm going to go over smashing it. Again, all you do is place your hand at the butt of the knife, push down, and go forward. Super easy. And if you guys have watched any of my other videos, the neat, cool trick about trying to mince garlic is kosher salt. Again, I like to use kosher salt for everything I cook. Unfortunately, it doesn't have iodine in it, but that's okay because we find iodine in our diet and other foods. Kind of compensates. I always use kosher salt. It's cheap, it's good to use, easy to work with, has a little bit of grit to it. It's good stuff. So now that we got that all done, we can move to the next step, which is taking the seeds out of your butternut squash. What I did with this is I got the whole squash, I chopped off the stem side of it, and I cut it in half. Now make sure that you're ready when you cut it in half, because it can be somewhat difficult depending on just how ripe your squash is. And you just take your spoon and you core it out much like you would core out a pumpkin. If you want, you can save these seeds and add them to a garnish at the end of the soup. All you do is clean them up real good and toast them. Let's get that out of the way. Put that in the sink. Clean up our board. Now the next thing we're going to do is talk about the other ingredients that we use for this. We already know that we have Granny Smith apple, red onion, 2 cloves of garlic, and approximately a tablespoon of rough chopped garlic. We're also going to be using a 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg, a 1/4 teaspoon of cayenne pepper, 2 tablespoons of unsalted butter. I always use unsalted butter when I cook food because you can monitor the amount of salt that's in your food. You always want to be able to monitor the salt content of your food, and you don't know how much salt is in butter. So the best way to handle it is just use unsalted butter. It's cheaper than salted butter because it's not as popular, but it works just fine, and then we can monitor the amount of salt we have in our food. The other thing I'm using is bay leaf. I use bay leaf in most of my cooking. This is about approximately 1 regular size bay leaf. These are kind of on the small side, so we're using 2. And the other thing I'd like to talk about next is this is 8 ounces of chicken stock. Remember guys, when you're roasting a chicken, or any time you ever eat a chicken, I'm sure that all of us have gone to the store and purchased a rotisserie chicken, and your family gobbled it up, and the only thing you have left is the carcass. Most people throw it away, but don't throw that carcass away, because chicken stock is found in so much of the food that we make in today's cooking, and that stuff is liquid gold. You just take the whole carcass, even if you have the skin still, throw it in a pot with the skin, with the carcass, bones and everything, and you cook it on high heat. Once it starts to bubble up, once it starts boiling, turn it down to a simmer and just let it ride. It's going to take about 1 to 2 hours depending on how much chicken you're using. I also save my turkey carcasses, goose carcasses, duck, pretty much any bird. You can turn it into a delicious, great homemade chicken stock by throwing it in a pot, adding some carrots, adding some onion, a little bit of garlic and water, and voila. After 1 or 2 hours, you got perfect chicken stock, and then at that point all you have to do is filter it. The last step before I put this in the oven is to coat it very lightly. You can use either butter or olive oil. For today's application, I'm using olive oil. You want to make sure too that you sprinkle just a little bit of salt on, but before you do that, make sure that you have your oil and you kind of rub it onto the squash, because remember, this is going to bake at 350 degrees until it's fully roasted. Should take somewhere around an hour to an hour and a half to roast it. You'll know it's done because you'll just know it's done because it'll look different than it does now. You don't want to use too much salt, but just sprinkle just a little bit on there. Maybe a teaspoon total for all 4 pieces should do the trick. Next step is to grab the pan. Turn our oven up to 350 degrees, let it preheat, and we're going to take this and we're going to lay them on the pan so they all fit end to head. Just like that. I'm going to go ahead and throw this in the oven. In the meantime, take a short break, take it easy, because it's going to take about an hour to get this stuff roasted. Guys, we're back from that short break to finish up another great recipe in Molly's Kitchen. If you see here, we have a perfectly roasted piece of butternut squash. I already took the liberty of pouring out the other 3 that we had. This was 2 squashes, cut them in half, you end up with 4. This is the one that's left, and I'm going to show you. You want this to be fork tender. When I say that, I mean you should be able to take a fork or a spoon or a knife or whatever you have and be able to poke through it. Now in some ovens, I'd like to mention that this process goes a little bit faster. Like if you have a convection oven, you can usually roast a piece of butternut squash in approximately 30 to 45 minutes. When you're using a standard regular kitchen oven, it could take all the way up to 2 or 3 hours. This one, in this case, took about an hour and a half. Make sure when you take this out of the oven, you're going to have a pool of juice right here. That's not oil that collected there. That's actually the juice from the butternut squash, and you want to save that because you can use it in the recipe. So we're going to go ahead and just take our spoon and cup into the piece of butternut squash, and with any luck, you'll be able to get most of it. This is like any other piece of squash. It can be kind of challenging at times, but if you've roasted it good enough, your product should pretty much just fall out. My mom has been bothering me to make this recipe and make a video of it because she wants to try some of this soup. And I got the Jedi trick. Now that we have that nice and cleaned up, we can go ahead and set this in our sink. And we're going to go ahead and take another short break while I get everything ready to actually start cooking it. And we're almost at the final step of our roasted butternut squash soup. As you can see, I have a regular stock pot here. It's on the stove, turned to high. I'm just going to simply add some butter to this. swirl it around a little bit just so the butter doesn't burn. Now that we've melted our butter, we're going to go ahead and add the apples first. I should probably mention at this point that when I cut the apples in the first part of this video, I hadn't yet roasted my squash. We're going to go ahead and add the onion. That's about 1.5 cups of onion. And to stop your apples from browning, you can always acidulate the water. If you don't know what that word means, it just means adding an acid to the water. You can use lime, lemons, even vinegar works. But it stops your apples from browning. You don't want any more color in this soup than you already have, because as you recall, we have different colors of roasting here because, you know, like anything else in nature, it's not perfect. We have some spots that are darker than others. It's going to come together. It's going to be a beautiful orange soup. We don't want it to be a burnt orange soup. We just want it to be a beautiful orange soup. Go ahead and give this a quick stir. What we're looking for here, guys, is to make sure that our onions are translucent. Once your onions are translucent, then you can start adding all the liquids, the salts and peppers and everything else. Keep a good stir on it. I'm using a thin metal stainless steel pot, so things cook quite a bit faster on this than a normal stock pot would have. If you put your vegetables in there and they don't sizzle, you know that your pot is not hot enough. You want to make sure you keep it at a good temperature, but not too hot, not too low. Those onions are just about translucent. If you want to check it out, they look something like that. At this point, we're going to go ahead and add the spices. We've got, remember, 2 cloves of garlic, medium-sized cloves. Some people like more garlic than others. Pretty much whatever you desire for your particular palate. We're going to go ahead and add the ginger in there too. Now remember, we had about a tablespoon of ginger. We want to get that kind of cooking a little bit too. And then we're going to add the 2 bay leaves. I put the cayenne pepper, 1/4 teaspoon, no more, no less. Cayenne pepper has a real tendency to get hotter as it cooks. So you want to be really diligent in making sure you don't put too much, because it's going to be hot if it's too much. I also have the 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg in here. Give that a good stir. Almost time to add the butternut. What we're also looking for too, guys, when we're sauteing all this is the apples. You want to make sure that they're almost fork tender. Remember, fork tender is when you can stab it with a fork and it goes right through it. You should know just by looking at the color, if you've ever cooked with apples, like making apple pie, you just know because it's got that distinctive color, something like that. At this point, it's time to add your chicken stock. Remember, 8 ounces of chicken stock. And don't forget, guys, that you can always make your own even better chicken stock. The more bones and skin and fatty tissue you have, the better your stock is going to be. And don't be afraid to add vegetables to your stock, because that's how you make veggie stock. You just throw vegetables together in a pot and there you go. We're going to go ahead and gently place this in here. Get your spatula clean. We're going to use our old-time friend, the French whisk. If you don't know what a French whisk is, the wires on it tend to be thicker, thus being able to cut through whatever kind of soup or whatever you may be cooking. Now, the part that I forgot to mention is that you want to add half chicken stock, half water, and I neglected to get the water. Hold on just a second while I grab that. Now remember, guys, we had 8 ounces of chicken stock, and we're doing half chicken stock, half water. So we had 8 ounces of chicken stock, we're going to add 8 ounces of water. While we wait for this to heat up, I'm going to tell you about wonderful blenders. Blenders are one of those things that you really get what you pay for. It's just about tax season right now. So some of you may have an influx in your income and you might have a couple $100 laying around. If you do, you might want to invest in the Vitamix blender. I picked mine up at Costco. It was on sale. It ran about $400. They're expensive, but once you have a Vitamix, smoothies, soups, whatever you want to put in, will never be the same. When you use a regular blender, you might have the problem of having gritty soup. So to solve that problem, for those of you that don't have that kind of a blender, you can always, after you've roasted your butternut squash, you can always take it and put it in a KitchenAid style blender. It doesn't necessarily have to be a KitchenAid, but you treat this much like you would a mashed potato, and you essentially whip it. Some people like to use tomato sauce. Some people like to use heavy cream in their butternut squash soup. I prefer to stay away from that. I would rather have ginger, which you don't normally find in a butternut squash soup. And all we're doing, guys, is we're bringing this up to temperature, and once all the stuff is homogenized, you'll still have pieces of apple. Don't forget your bay leaf. I made a terrible mistake the other night when I ate some enchiladas. I actually left a bay leaf in there, and it was really harsh. I woke up the next morning and I could still taste that bay leaf in my mouth. I guess I could say that it was a good experience because now I actually really know what bay leaf tastes like. I wouldn't recommend trying it. Better if you take those out before you throw your food in the blender, your mixer, or whatever you may be using. Don't forget, while this is going, I spoke to you guys earlier about using pumpkin seeds as a garnish. You can even use the squash seeds from this squash. If you roast them in your oven, they work out just fine too. I'm actually using specifically pumpkin seeds, and we're just going to lightly toast them. So go ahead and put that on the fire, and be careful, they're going to toast fast. And that pan is hot, so when they're done, we're going to need to stick it in a ramekin so they don't continue to cook and end up being burnt. This soup is looking pretty good. It's just about there. Make sure you keep a quick stir on your pumpkin seeds because it's a fine line between a toasted pumpkin seed and a burnt one. I like to use every part of whatever I may be using. And I know that earlier in this video when I showed you, when I cored out the butternut squash, I just tossed it in the trash because the reality is I'm not going to use it. But you should really try in your own home not to throw away things like the seeds or the vegetables. I could have used that in a vegetable stock. It would have been delicious. This has got a light simmer on it right now. We want to get it hotter than that, but we just keep on giving it the stir with our trusty friend, the French whisk. Make sure as this gets closer to being hotter and hotter and hotter, that you keep an eye out for those bay leaves. Those were pretty small, so we might have a hard time locating them, but we will eventually find them. I've actually located mine. Go ahead and give these a quick stir, and those are actually done. So we're going to set those to the side, turn the heat off, put the pan in the sink. This meal is coming together quite nicely, folks. This is steaming really good. We're going to take another short break here in just a minute, and I'm going to show you how to pretty much puree it. It's really simple. You just add your stuff to the blender, turn it on, make sure that you know it's done because it'll be velvety smooth. If you check it out, I don't know if you can see it from where the camera's at, but this soup is steaming, bubbling, doing exactly what it needs to do. Keep that on the heat for about 2 more minutes, and then we're going to step over to the blender to puree it. We're back again, guys, for the very last and final step. It's been several hours now, getting kind of tired. It's going to come out good though. Here we have our overpriced Vitamix blender, and although it may have been 400 bucks, it was arguably the best 400 bucks I've ever spent because this will very likely be the last blender that I ever buy. In addition to that, it'll be the best one I ever buy. I should pitch this ad to Vitamix and maybe show off their blender. We got our butternut squash soup here. I got my plate set up. I got my pumpkin seeds, and we don't want to forget our good friend sour cream. We're going to take a dollop of that and put it right in the middle of the soup. So we're going to go ahead and take this and use a ladle. It's hot. We already took the bay leaves out. And the one step that we haven't done yet is we hadn't added salt and pepper. You add that to whatever your taste is. Some people like more salt, some people like more pepper. Whatever's clever and whatever works. We go ahead and ladle that into the Vitamix. It's going to get kind of loud, guys, so that Vitamix blender with this huge motor makes a lot of noise. Maybe I should let Vitamix know about that too. Screwing up my video being too loud. I did take out my spatula, guys, because you want to save every bit of this soup that you can. Take your spatula and clean out your pot. Get all that goodness in there. We're going to just pour that right into there. The next step is arguably the funnest. Take that and put it in there. Another great thing about having a Vitamix blender is that it comes with this neat thing called a plunger. And that's going to help us stir the stuff around. So we're going to go ahead and take the top off of it. Cover it with your hands so it doesn't spray all over the place. Turn your blender up to whatever setting you think you may need to puree it, and go ahead and turn it on. Take your plunger. Remember, we're pureeing this until it's velvety smooth. Okay guys, now you may need to add just a touch more water, but we're going to go ahead and grab a cup for that, so hold on just a minute. It's not going to take much, maybe a quarter cup, so go ahead and put the lid back on that, turn it back on, and put your water in. Guys, one more thing. Be careful when you put your hand over here because that soup is really hot. We're going to go ahead and open this up, and this is the time that we adjust our seasonings. It's too bad my wife's not in this video. You see her laughing at me right now. I like a fair amount of salt, so I'm putting in close to a tablespoon. Remember too guys, that a good stock also needs salt and pepper. What we did when I was in culinary school is we would add salt to it, but in addition to that, we would make what's called a sachet. It's where you take a piece of cheesecloth and you put in your bay leaves and whole peppercorns, not ground. You may want to put in a star anise. You know, there's a bunch of different stuff you could add to it. So now that we have the salt in there, we're going to take some freshly ground pepper. Now, unfortunately, my pepper grinder here has black pepper in it, but that's okay. Typically, you would want to use a white pepper because you're not trying to color the soup. So go ahead and put the lid back on there. We're going to put the top on this time so we don't burn our hand. Okay, turn it back on. Taste. It's pretty good stuff. It's done. The last thing we gotta do, take this off, put this back, look at my dirty counter. We're gonna go ahead and get our plate and our bowl that we have here. Don't forget our good friend, the trusty ladle. Pour that in your bowl. And remember those pumpkin seeds that we toasted? We're going to go ahead and add those next. And the last step is going to be to add the sour cream. put one good dollop right in the middle. That'll be all, guys. Our roasted butternut squash soup. Thank you so much for staying tuned. Follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.